Greetings, I'm Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis. Welcome to Liberation Psychology, Ethical Consideration for Practice with Marginalized Communities. I am so glad that you're joining us today and grateful that our CEU on today is being provided by Pepperdine University and the Diversity, Social Justice, and Inclusion Committee of the DC Psychological Association. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the land that has been cultivated by the Tongva peoples and other indigenous peoples whose life, history, sacrifice, and current day realities need to be acknowledged and protected. I want to recognize that we are meeting during a socio-political climate of hostility, instability, and overt violence, as well as the realities of a global pandemic. I want to also name that this program was organized in recognition of Juneteenth as well as Pride Month. Oppression must not only be addressed in the larger society, but in the field of psychology as well. Our first presenter on today will give an overview of liberation psychology. And our presenter is Dr. Lillian Comos-Diaz, a clinical psychologist in private practice and a clinical professor at George Washington University, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Lillian is the recipient of the 2019 American Foundation Association, American Psychological Association Gold Medal Lifetime Award in the practice of psychology. Our second presentation will be Liberation Psychology and LGBTQ+ communities. Our second presenter is Dr. Annalise Singh, a counselor and counseling psychologist who serves as Chief Diversity Officer at Tulane University. Annalise's scholarship and community organizing explores the resilience, trauma, and identity development experiences of queer and trans people, with a focus on young people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Dr. Singh is the author of the Racial Healing Handbook, Practical Activities to Help You Challenge Privilege, Confront Systemic Racism, and Engage in Collective Healing, and the Queer and Trans Resilience Workbook. I will present to you finally, Applying Liberation Psychology to Black Americans. I'm Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis, a licensed clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at Pepperdine University, and director of the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory. A former APA representative to the United Nations whose work in trauma psychology has been honored by APA, the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, as well as the California Psychological Association, my home state association. I am a candidate for president-elect of the American Psychological Association. I am honored by your presence here today and also extend a warm welcome to those who will watch our replay. Thank you so much for joining us here, and I will turn it over now to Dr. Lillian Comos-Diaz.
Hello, and welcome to this symposium. Today, I will present on liberation psychology core elements, ethics in liberation method, and liberation psychotherapy. Next slide, please. Liberation psychology has a concept that we need to be grounded in who we are and share our positionality. So this is my positionality. Next slide, please. And because of the positionality that liberation psychology advocates, I'd like to share with you, actually invite you to do a self-assessment on liberation psychology. You can do that for you and for your clients as well. And these are the questions. What is my cultural heritage? The culture of my parents and ancestors? What is the cultural meaning of my intersecting identities? How did I become, or how did I decide to become a psychologist? How did I become interested in liberation psychology? That's a very good question for this presentation. What aspects of my worldview are congruent or incongruent with liberation psychology? What do I believe to be the relationship between culture, psychology, oppression, liberation, and social justice? Next slide, please. I bring to you liberation psychology as an innovative and radical discipline. First of all, it comes from the global South, Latin American context. Ignacio Martín Baró is the architect. It brings new epistemology, knowledge from the perspective of the oppressed, the marginalized, not from the oppressor. It creates a new horizon attending to people's needs with a new practice transforming reality through learning about what it is and what is not, and also addresses new goals as affirming people's strengths, values, and virtues. Next slide, please. Liberation psychology is also different in many ways because it is a syncretistic discipline and is in constant evolution. It may have been born out of theology of liberation, pedagogy of the oppressed, psychology of the colonized, decolonial psychologists. However, the evolution of the constant evolution is indicated by the critical race theory, the incorporation of LGBTQ plus studies, and the incorporation of humanist and mujerista psychologists. Next slide, please. So I will concentrate today on core concepts of liberation psychology: acompañamiento, concientización, social justice action, radical therapeutic relationship, and hope. Next slide, please. Acompañamiento means that you stand alongside those who need witnessing in order to nurture their critical consciousness and to recover their discounted knowledge and wisdom. In this way, you become a container in order to hold a safe space where you're gonna be witnessing testimonials of the oppressed. Testimonials relate, it's a liberation psychology method that has to do with people giving their testimony within the context of oppression and the sociopolitical situation. Next slide, please. Critical consciousness or conscientización basically means that you transform your reality, but you do that through a dialectical process. And this process is taught by dialogue and is not imposed by a colonizing psychology. It helps to engage in a gradual decoding of your world, develops a new understanding of yourself, and therefore your social identity, who you are vis-a-vis your social identity. It changes your relationship with reality in order to change your relationship with the world. Therefore, your own liberation is connected to a global liberation. Next slide. So Paulo Freire and Maceo identify several critical consciousness questions. However, I would like you to concentrate in the following. For whom are we doing this? Against whom? By whom? In favor of whom? In favor of what? And to what end? These are really central questions that we as liberation psychologists ask ourselves when we're engaging in any kind of connection with reality. Next slide, please. Now, what do we have this critical consciousness questions? Because mainstream psychological research, and I would say theory as well, is not neutral, is not innocent, because it tends to support the status quo. It prefers global north knowledge over global south knowledge and wisdom. And of course, it supports power inequality, where psychologist is the expert rather than collaborator. Next slide, please. Therefore, ethics in liberation psychology method foster the inclusion of community participants or anyone who's going to be affected by the research, transparency, confidentiality, and real informed consent, disclosure of conflict of interest, and of course of hidden agendas, selection of interviewers or researchers. In other words, what is your positionality? Collection of data, and this is focused on participants' life experience. Analysis of data, in other words, whose values is driving this analysis? Discussion and communication of findings, and incorporation of indigenous cultural methods for social justice action. Next slide, please. Now let's talk more about liberation psychotherapy, because liberation psychotherapy values all of the concepts in mainstream psychotherapy, the main core concepts. However, liberation psychotherapy is unique in that integrates evidence, practice, cultural, and indigenous healing, fosters self-healing and self-regeneration through the connection with the inner healer, addresses trauma at multiple levels, empowers clients to define their own social justice action, not what the psychologist defines as a social justice action. And very important in liberation psychotherapy is that it addresses the commitment of the therapist to pursue personal work. That could be therapist, meditation, mindfulness, art, activism, art for the sake of social justice. And this is so because, let's face it, when you work with the oppressed and the marginalized, it's challenging, it's tough, and it enhances your compassion fatigue. It may create burnout, etc. So it's important that you model self-care and personal work. Next slide, please. The therapeutic relationship in liberation psychology is actually unique in the sense that it's grounded in the indigenous concept of interconnectedness. In other words, you are my other me, tú eres mi otro yo, meaning that we are mirrors of each other. Based on interconnectedness, we create permeability, and that is you embody your client's distress. This process allows to create a fusion of the individual differences between you as a psychologist and your client into creating a field of experience and feeling. And that helps you understand your client's pain, oppression, suffering at a rational, non-rational, and intuitive levels. And that allows you to commit to a collective healing, to conviviality and buen vivir, which is an indigenous concept of living life in full. Next slide, please. So liberation psychotherapists aim to engage in radical humility, which means relating to everyone from a human to human perspective, examining power differentials, and specifically those between psychologists and client. Recognize that clients are experts on their own experience, developing co-participatory relationships and supporting clients' knowledge, wisdom, and values. Next slide, please. Liberation psychotherapists also aim to express radical empathy, manifesting compassion, respect, altruism, positive regard towards clients, and understanding that healing is mutual. You as a psychologist, your client's healing is your own client. It's your own healing. So it's a mutuality of healing. Next slide, please. So Ignacio Martin Baró stated that liberation psychology is the future of whole psychology. I would like to add that liberation psychology is the future because it is a psychology of hope. And this is a self-assessment you can do on your own or with your clients, involving who are you in connection to your parents and ancestors? What life lessons did they provide you? What stories are you telling yourself? What matters to you about your current situation? What do you need as opposed to what do you want? What or whom are you calling on for strengths? The fact that you have gone through this challenge, whatever the pain it is, what does it say about you? But most importantly, what does it say about the socio-political system? What does it say about systemic oppression? What is of ultimate concern to you? Next slide, please. And now I also going to invite you to continue with liberation psychology self-assessment at the end of this seminar. But I want you to concentrate on this critical question, and that is, are you ready to become a liberation psychologist? Next slide, please. In summary, liberation psychologists aim to promote liberation at multiple levels, including personal oppression, structural oppression. They also aim to accompany clients and anyone who is in a marginalized situation. They also recognize the relationship between your personal distress and oppression, social oppression, foster recovery of historical memory and discounted knowledge, nurture reconnection with the inner healer that we all have, foment social justice action, and cultivate hope and global solidarity. The material in this presentation is included in the edited book, Liberation Psychology, Theory, Method, Practice, and Social Justice. And if we have time, I do want to share my references. Next slide, please. I guess we don't have, okay, fine. Our next presenter is going to be our own Annalise Sin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lillian Comas-Diaz, and thank you, Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis. Thank you all to the beloved community who has gathered today. I always am learning from these two gigantic luminaries and sheroes who are here. I'm always pinching myself to see, like, wow, am I really getting to share space with them? So thank you both so much, and vote for Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis for APA president, and ask 5 of your friends to do so as well. And so, hi, my name is Annalise Singh, and I use she and they pronouns. I identify as a South Asian, mixed race, queer, genderqueer femme person with lots of temporarily able-bodied kind of advantages in the world, a hell of a lot of class and educational privilege at this point in my life. And, you know, it was such an honor to write a chapter with my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Nushka Akil, Dr. Brianna Parker, and Dr. Fallon Thacker. So I just wanted to acknowledge them, that a lot of what I'm going to share is directly related to the chapter we wrote in Dr. Comas-Diaz's book. So we're going to go to the next slide. And, you know, I think that as we get started, you know, just as Dr. Bryant-Davis did, you know, I'm Zooming, as many of you are, right? We're on Indigenous land. I'm I just returned, moved home to New Orleans last summer. I had lived in Atlanta for a few decades and got, had to force myself, reteach myself about the indigenous land I was on. And as I moved to New Orleans, I was like, wow, I'm like having to reteach myself that. It's important labor to be able to understand kind of, I think, the foundations of liberation psychology. So I want to say hello to you from Chitimacha and many other First Nations lands. And the first name, the original name of New Orleans is Bulbancha. And if you just even say that word, I know many of you love to come to New Orleans, but if you just say Bulbancha, you'll feel the power of that word. We're also right in front of Juneteenth, Freedom Day for Black communities. And I think for white folks and non-Black folks of color like myself, Black people did not create anti-Black racism. And so it's really on us folks who are white and non-Black people of color to undo this. And I wanted to share this image of the New Yorker. We can finally say, Derek Chauvin, white police officer, murdered Black man George Floyd, but we could already say that, right? The verdict is now in, but I think whether it's anti-Asian racism or police brutality with Black communities, we know what's going on. We know there's a need for liberation psychology. And even though Martin Barrow might not have wrestled with anti-Blackness as much as I would have liked him to do, we can do that in queer and trans liberation psychology. We must do that across all of liberation psychology. So let's go to the next slide. And one of the things that happened last summer is after George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, Dominique Remy Fells and Rhea Milton were also murdered as Black trans women. If we're doing liberation psychology the way I would hope Martine Barrow would want us to continue to evolve it, we have to have Black trans women at the center, not just to say they're at the center, but to actually make sure that every single presentation, every single intervention that we're thinking about, like our office practices, our interpersonal relationships, like do Black trans women not just get to enter these spaces, but that they're spaces where they can embody their own being. So yeah, we'll go to the next slides. And as we move past these acknowledgements, I just wanted to say we have limited time together today, but I'm going to talk about how we can locate ourselves really beyond our genders and sexual orientations and liberation psychology, and some important questions we have, continued questions in liberation psych related to colonization, anti-Black racism, internalized whiteness, and maybe some summary of next steps. So as we go to the next slide, I just want to acknowledge that in queer and trans counseling, and I've been a part of this too. I mean, I had such mixed feelings as I was working alongside some fierce advocates. Just, it felt like sometimes we were begging for affirmative care. And we were really, I think, building a lot of our initial interventions and advocacy on the ones that white, gay men and women had done, and lesbian women who had said, hey, look at us, we're real. If you look at the definition of affirmation, it's like we exist, right? But if we go to the next slide and we look at the dictionary definition of liberation, I don't know if this is how Martin Barrow would have defined it, but I think we know when we read his words, when we read, Lillian's book and all the beautiful chapters within it, there's something about going beyond, but there's something always about freedom and removal of barriers. So I just wanted to say that, right? And it's why Juneteenth is so important for us to act on, to understand how white supremacy was set up very intentionally as a racial hierarchy, and that, as we'll talk about, queer and trans folks must be erased if white supremacy is to be embodied in the world. So I just want to trouble the idea of affirmative care and kind of be like, yes, this whole liberation psych thing gives us a potential pathway forward. So as we go to the next slide, the other thing I want to say is that we've done some dedications, but I think we also have to do some gratitude. And we definitely did in writing this chapter that, we had to think that as a profession, if we're really to move to a more liberatory approach to working with queer and trans folks, we've got to center BIPOC and queer and trans communities. And so we know that, 2 Black queer women women started the Black Lives Matter movement, but we also know that BIPOC, queer, and trans people are constantly on social media, in the streets, you know, asking us to do better and be better. And so it's time to do that. And I do think liberation psychology has some potential, I don't know if I want to call them answers and solutions, but pathways, maybe a compass. So as we go to the next slide, just in liberation psychology, you know, we've got to, as Dr. Comas-Diaz was saying, we have to start with ourselves, our own locations, who we are, right? What are positionalities? We can say all the identities, but then we got to look at, you know, what Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw said, how do those interlocking oppressions really set us up for certain advantages or disadvantages, all within the realm of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, right? But I think as we started to write this chapter, one of the things we really had to wrestle with is like there's silences in Martine Barrow's work around anti-Blackness, and there are also silences around queer and trans folks. Shit, let's take that in. Why would there be silences and erasure about queer and trans folks and about anti-Blackness in a beautiful and quite powerful approach to liberation psychology? And as we started to think about it, we're like, okay, we believe that it's just a hunch, it's a hypothesis. Maybe we could dialogue in the chat box, but maybe it's due to the role and promise of Western and Christian colonization. We know that colonizers, white colonizers specifically, sought to take over lands of indigenous people and sought to often violently convert indigenous communities who often embraced and were holders of sacred rites and rituals of their tribes. They were often queer and trans folks, right? They may not have called themselves queer and trans folks, right? But, you know, part of that colonization was kind of forcing people to take on Christian values and practices, which included anti-queer and trans polemics. Martine Barrow was born and raised in Spain, the land of the original Christian Western colonizers, very adjacent and participatory of a lot of the anti-Blackness of what we came to call the East Atlantic slave trade, right? So, you know, he was a Jesuit priest, and so it was very likely that he had no official training or awareness or issues of concern with queer and trans folks. I don't know for sure, right? This is our hypotheses as we started to dig in. But we certainly know that the Catholic Church and Christianity, as it can be practiced in a brutal way, often has no or little concern for our communities in terms of care, love, compassion, liberation. So as we started to wrestle with this erasure of queer and trans community within liberation psych itself, we began to wonder if Martine Barrow was alive, if we called them into a courageous conversation, maybe a difficult dialogue. And we were learning, you know, not like in a condescending way, but like, hey, let's conversate, right? You know, and if that conversation was with queer and trans BIPOC activists and, you know, street activists and community organizers, and maybe even some of our ancestors, you know, during that time, if some of them joined the dialogue, we wondered how some of his key liberation psych tenets might apply to us. And so as we go to the next slide, the very, you know, the first one we're going to wrestle with is kind of like recovering historical memory that Martine Barrow talked about. He talked about, you know, we have to recover our historical memory and understand, like, if we look at anti-Blackness, it was set up, you know, King Henry, Prince Henry in Portugal, Spain, like all these places, it was set up for a reason. It was set up in a very brutal form of Western European whiteness colonized much of the world. But when we look across history, we know that queer and trans folks have existed throughout recorded history on every continent inhabited by human beings. And as we go to the next slide and we go, what happened? We think that if we are really to bring recovering historical memory, one of the liberation psych tenets, alive, we've got to reteach ourselves from the beginning that, you know, if we look at gay liberation and Pride Month and like how we like to like buy vodka at pride parades and stuff like that, we need to move away from that and look at the origins of Stonewall that are very Black and brown and about resistance and about undoing anti-Blackness. But we also have to look and see that I don't know that we'll ever find the answers. And I think there's a lot of grief, at least for me, and I'm sure for many of you, when you think about this, like so many of our stories have been erased that I don't know that we'll ever know, like how specifically colonization erased the Mahu of Hawaii and the Polynesian islands, the queer and trans people of that area, the Hijra, the trans folks of South Asia, the Sangopas of the continent of Africa. I mean, we have so many questions, but we do know that when we're doing queer and trans counseling, we can no longer ever start with sex and gender in the research we have in psychology on sex and gender to guide us, because a lot of those studies are based in majority white samples. Black communities, BIPOC communities are very invisible. And it doesn't actually talk about the context of like how we got here. So I think, you know, a very first piece of liberation psychology with queer and trans folks, if we're to center BIPOC folks, which means we're talking about colonization in a whole different way, we're grieving. Okay. So when we go to the next slide, I think, you know, I want to kind of dig into each of these very briefly. That recovering historical memory, this is a journey for the rest of our lives. And whether we're in mental health, we're straight, we're cis, we're trans, we're queer, we're some combination of that, or we're BIPOC, we're able-bodied, we're disabled, across all of our identities and experiences, recovering historical memory is huge. But the next thing, and you know, I was born and raised in Bolbancha, New Orleans. So I took 12 years of French. So I always have to practice my Spanish pronunciation, and I apologize. But if we're to do and engage Conscientización, consciousness raising, right? You know, Martin Barrow, you know, leaning on some of the work from Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you know, he really believed that oppressed communities could move towards social justice action if they had awareness and knowledge about historical and current systems. That's recovering historical memory, right? But then we have to have the consciousness raising about that. Well, doesn't that remind you of when Black students were suing historically white universities to gain access? When we think about Black abolition movements, when we think about indigenous resistance to being put in kind of like white schools, right? And so I think one crucial piece, and my hunch is, our hunch is that if we were to dialogue with Martin Barrow about consciousness raising, that he would say that's a crucial aspect of queer and trans psychology, that because we've always had to teach ourselves about ourselves, just like white folks don't learn about Black history. It's not a even comparison. Like, we don't usually have cis and straight folks teaching queer and trans folks about ourselves. Like, we got to first we got to find ourselves, and then we got to find other people. And sometimes we don't find ourselves as queer and trans folks until we find other people. And there are additional layers as BIPOC, queer and trans folks, right? So in our interventions, whether we're inside of our office or hopefully outside of our office as well, those four walls, we're looking for, like, how do we embed consciousness raising? And that's a huge intervention, right? It's not just an intake assessment, but this is what we're doing. And I think once we do that consciousness raising and we connect it to recovering historical memory, then when we work with our clients, when we work with ourselves, we know that false binaries of gender and sexual orientation are not just harmful to queer and trans folks, but they're harmful to all people. Some indigenous communities have said there are as many genders as there are stars in the skies, you know, but I think there are way more than 2, 4, 10. There are a heck of a lot of genders that we have in our present day. And so many cultures and tribes and First Nations knew that deeply. And so that consciousness raising is really important. The third kind of piece I want to talk about in Lib Psych is really about de-ideologizing psychology. Now, this is an interesting one. I would have loved to talk to Martin Barrow about this, because he had this whole thing about like undoing jargon, right? I do it. I know many of us do it, and we're trying to unlearn accessible, like, how do we make language accessible, and just not make it accessible, but use accessible language, right? But what he talked about with this tenet was, you know, how would psychology change and be demythologized if it was actually in the service of freedom and the support of the rights of the oppressed, as Dr. Comas-Diaz said. So just for a moment, imagine our queer and trans counseling environments if freedom in centering queer and trans BIPOC folks was the goal. Like it was unabashedly the goal. I have a feeling that Martine Barrow might have been, yeah, when we do that, we're getting to the root of all of our internalized oppression. It's no longer a, I'm serving this one queer and or trans client. Like actually we're in deep relationship as we're all healing, and we're more upfront about that. And so I want to make sure we can get to Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis. So I'm going to whiz through the next two, but problematización, and I apologize again for my my tongue that was like trained in like Southern English, I would say. But this is problematizing, right? And so as a discipline, as in psychology, we move away from more of a mental health industrial complex that uses the DSM and looks at the problem located in people, in individuals. And we say, in the DSM, there are actually no racism, not otherwise specified disorders. They're not sexism and heterosexism disorders or cisgenderism disorders that we have been trained, whether it's psychology, counseling, social work, I don't care what, mental health, psychiatry, we've been trained that illness resides in a people as opposed to in a society, right? And so what happens when we're in relationship with our clients is we're using these diagnoses, right? And we struggle with that. What if we made that more transparent and we found ways to undo that? And I start to wonder, like, what would a liberation psychology DSM look like? Well, I have a feeling it would look like, if this was the DSM, it would get burned. Martine Barrow would probably light the DSM on fire, and we'd have to look at like this, we'd have to diagnose society. And you can read that in his writing. And the last one I'll talk about is realism critico, which is really about counter stories to oppression. And there's this common chant you will hear often Black freedom fighters share that is based on Assata Shakur's very famous chant. It is the duty to fight for our freedom, is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I think especially as we approach Juneteenth, as we are hopefully all unlearning the anti-Black racism that we've all been taught since birth, you know, I think a real counter story is, what does Black freedom fighting look like within queer and trans psychology if Black community members are not always have to freaking lead it, you know? If cis and straight folks are leading it, if white non-Black folks of color are leading it, I think then we start to thread all of these tenets together. We're recovering our historical memory. We're consciousness raising in our environments. We're demythologizing psychology. We're problematizing who psychology was built for and who the ethics code was built for. It's usually not built for our clients. It's actually built to protect us. And then we get those counter stories and can know, okay, happy Pride, awesome, but actually we're celebrating like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, many of the BIPOC roots of what we've come to know as Pride. And in the last slide, it's just a quick summary that I don't have the answers. I just have so many questions, and I want to be in dialogue with you all as a community over time, probably for the rest of our lives. Like, how can liberation psychology help us ask better questions? You know, how can we learn more of the lineage of queer and trans resistance, both within and outside liberation psychology, and start threading them together? And in doing so, how do we center the colonization and resistance stories to internalize whiteness and anti-Black white racism that's just embedded in queer and trans psychology, counseling in our communities? Once we do that, then we can know the journey we're on. It's about resilience and how we're resisting just, you know, oppression. I don't study resilience, everyday resilience. I study resilience to oppression, right? But when we know that resilience and survival, we can start working with our clients and ourselves to moving past resilience to thriving and liberation. So I cannot wait to hear from Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis, and y'all know how I feel about voting for her. So please vote for her. And I can't wait to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much to both of you. My heart is full and I am excited and just so appreciative of those who are here on today and those who are watching the replay. I want to talk today for about our remaining time on Black Minds Matter, applying liberation psychology to Black Americans. And I want to acknowledge my co-author in our chapter, Liberation Psychology, and also Dr. Siobhan is one of my directors of strategy, along with Dr. Lillian Comos-Diaz. Next slide, please. I want to name that I am a Black woman and that it is important that I sit with both my areas of marginalization and my areas of privilege. Within the US, I hold privilege as a Christian, also as someone who is cisgender. I hold marginalization as a Black woman who lives with an invisible disability. I want to also resist and reject the myth of neutrality in scholarship. And so we bring meaning to our research, our teaching, and our practice based on our lived experience. So who I am matters, as I am sharing with you today, and who you are matters. Many times in training psychologists, there has been a focus on the quote unquote other. How do I understand their culture? How do I have the skills to work with them without first sitting with the truth of who we are? And I want to also name that your identity as a practitioner is not a mere stumbling block for you to try to get over or to pretend it doesn't exist or to erase it or to minimize it, but to know that your identity can also be a resource. When it is used with awareness and with humility, it is a part of the relationship that is in the room. Next slide, please. In the beginning was the word, and our words are powerful. Our words can speak life and healing. And so Lucille Clifton, a Black American woman poet, wrote, "Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." And James Baldwin said, "Nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so if we are psychologists refusing to look at oppression, refusing to look at racism and anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism and transphobia, then we are doing a fraction of the work and can also actually do harm. And so when we look at Lucille Clifton's quote, it reminds us to hold both pieces, the trauma, the travesty, and the triumph and the resilience. And many times people err on one side or the other. They can either look at the oppression and the wound and then operate from a place of pity or a Messiah complex, or they can celebrate and end up idealizing and miss the reality of our human wounds. And so when we sit with our marginalized clients and sit with ourselves, it is important that we hold both the impact of oppression and the mighty cultural resources that we possess. Next slide, please. It is important to know that racism is structural, is institutionalized, is systemic. So racism is bigger than individual bias. When we equate it simply with a bias or an attitude or a stereotype, then we may say, well, just avoid people who don't like you, right? If racism was limited to an attitude, if I knew a neighbor 3 doors down had racist ideas about Black people, I just wouldn't go over there. But the reality is it is institutionalized. So it shows up in our banking, it shows up in the education system, it shows up in housing, it shows up in employment, it shows up in our political system, it shows up in psychology. And then along with being structural, it is also personally mediated. So it shows up in our interpersonal relationships. It is also intergenerational and historical. And we can look at the transmission of trauma across generations. There is the physiological and neurological transmission in the sense that we know trauma affects the brain, but with the goodness of neuroplasticity, healing also affects the brain. And so we can pass down those experiences, both the impact of the violation and the impact of healing. It is also transmitted through observation. What did you see in terms of your parents, your grandparents, those who raised you, when they were interacting in environments where you were underrepresented? How were they treated and how did they have to adjust themselves in particular spaces? We also know that it is transmitted through direct messaging, what our parents warned us and told us, the talk that we had to have about how to try and navigate a hostile environment and return home safely. So racism affects us in terms of both stress and trauma, and it can also show up with your clients and with yourself as internalized racism. With internalized racism, I believe the lies that I have been told about myself and my community. So you may have clients who actually believe that they are inferior, or that they are less attractive, or that they are not as smart as a result of what we have been told about our contributions and our worth in this country. We also, as both of the prior speakers have addressed, have to be mindful of intersectionality. And intersectionality is beyond multiple identities. It is when you hold multiple oppressed identities. And so being mindful of the unique experience of not only being a Black person, but what does it mean to be Black and trans, to be Black and a person with a disability? What does it mean to be Black and undocumented? And so all of the layers of who we are need to be welcomed in the therapeutic space. Next slide, please. Underneath all of the violation and the realities of racism is white supremacy, this myth that white people are inherently better than other people. And anti-Black racism is not only taught to white people directly and indirectly, but it is also taught to Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. And so we can see anti-Black racism showing up in multiple communities, as people have been taught, as long as you are better than Black people, then you're doing well. And so we want to be mindful of the diverse ways it can show up, but also not be distracted about the root of that, which lies in white supremacy. Next slide, please. There are physical and mental health consequences of racism. It can show up with depression, anxiety, substance dependence, traumatic reactions and responses. In psychology, we see both overdiagnosis and underdiagnoses of Black people. It affects our cardiovascular system. It leads to higher rates of maternal death. It leads to higher rates of diabetes, cancer, stress, and asthma when we look at environmental racism. Next slide, please. So given the pervasiveness of racism and other forms of oppression, as well as the mental health consequences, it is unethical for psychologists to ignore racism in assessment, case formulation, and intervention. To see a Black client and never ask about, and never explore, and never address the mental health consequences of racism is unethical. We must ask ourselves the ethical question: is racism a source of psychological harm, stress, and/or trauma? And because we know it is, we are required to intervene. Next slide, please. Our multicultural guidelines lead us to recognize the importance of attending to the historical and contemporary experiences with power, privilege, and oppression, that we have to address issues of justice and also people's human rights and dignity. Next slide, please. So liberation psychology allows us to really look at what wellness means for marginalized communities living amidst oppression. It is important that we not only look at dismantling oppression, but also what it is we are building. And so we are building a sense of justice, a voice of agency and authenticity. Next slide, please. Black liberation psychology is born out of Black liberation theology. And Black liberation theology recognizes the value, the sacredness, the beauty, the necessity of centering the struggle of Black people. And as Dr. Annalise was speaking to, Black liberation theology had to be stretched by great pioneers who looked at the necessity of incorporating gender and sexuality as well. And so I encourage you to look at the work of Dr. Monica Coleman, Dr. James Cone, Candace Bimbao as well. Black liberation psychology is also rooted in African-centered psychology, which recognizes culture is medicine, justice is medicine, art is medicine, community is medicine, empowerment is medicine. Next slide, please. So we look at liberating interventions for Black people. They are psycho-spiritual efforts, and much of our Western psychology has ignored or demonized, pathologized religiosity and spirituality. But we recognize from our research, women and people of color endorse higher rates of spirituality and religiosity. So when it is ignored in the very development of our identities, in the very development of our interventions, who is being underserved? Women and people of color. So we look at interventions like healing circles created by the Association of Black Psychologists. We look at therapeutic interventions like Into Psychotherapy that looks at the principles from Nguza Saba. We look at hip hop psychology and interventions for group practice and individual practice. We look at the wonderful work that is being done in embodied healing, including liturgical dance, sacred dance. And we look at African-centered contemplative practice, the work of Dr. Shelley Harrell in the creation of soulfulness, as well as the work of Dr. Howard Stevenson using mindfulness to heal the wounds of racism. And we look at the work of womanist psychology, recognizing the beauty, the brilliance, the richness of Black women. And as we have called out in the public space, listen to Black women. We are often the caretakers and holders of our community, our culture, our history, our stories. And so storytelling, as Dr. Lillian talked about with testimonials, in our tradition, we would call it a testimony service, that there is something healing about telling our story and the ways in which we make it through. Next slide, please. I also have a model for addressing the wounds of racial trauma, and those steps in therapy are to help clients acknowledge the racial traumas that they have experienced, both covert and overt, helping them to be able to share their experience, and that is an individual and group therapy. So considering a narrative therapy approach, exploring issues of safety, self-care, and grieving the losses. What are the things that racism took from you? And this is not playing the race card or reverse racism. This is telling the truth. It is also giving people space to explore the shame and internalized racism that they may hold, helping us to explore anger. And I like to tell clients, it is healthy to be outraged about outrageous things. Racism is outrageous. Oppression is outrageous. And so it is not for us to pathologize the fact that people are outraged when terrible things have and continue to happen. We teach healthy coping strategies, and one of the differences between a liberation approach and traditional trauma psychology is resistance strategies, that we don't just teach people how to cope. We teach them to be empowered, to resist, to talk back, to organize, to run for office, to create new pathways, to protect their children, to be able to embody liberation. And so the end result for a trauma survivor is not just coping and meaning making, but resistance. Next slide, please. And so liberation psychology affirms that we seek freedom to live fully as ourselves, and we seek freedom to free others. As psychologists, we use our voices and interventions to combat every form of oppression. This is not a sprint, it is a marathon, and the marathon continues. Thank you so much for joining us, and I encourage you to read more in our text, Liberation Psychology, published by APA. Thank you and have a wonderful day.